Preparing planting beds is really a major part of what you do as a gardener when you're starting from scratch, starting a new bed. And really most of the gardening that we do is in planting beds, unless we're container gardeners. The planting beds are an important part of what we do as gardeners. And so how do you start a planting bed? Well, timing is really important, and ideally you should start preparing that bed a year in advance. You should start at least in the fall before the season you plan to plant in that area. And there are really a lot of good reasons for that. The fall of the year is a good time to take a soil sample. Soil samples can be submitted, tested, your recommendations returned to you, and then you're ready to make those changes that are necessary from your soil test report when you're ready to plant the garden the next spring. If you give yourself an entire year to prepare the bed, however, it allows you a lot more options for weed control and more options for amendment of the soil and improvement of the soil before you start planting. Weed control is critical when you have an area that has a lot of weeds that you intend to turn into a garden area. Fighting those weeds a year in advance and doing it thoroughly will pay off enormously in the long run. You'll kick yourself for years to come if you don't take that extra time. To control weeds in new planting beds, providing that you have this kind of time, and unfortunately a lot of us don't plan that far ahead, so we don't get that much of a jump on what we're going to do. But if you plan that far ahead, then you have time to control those weeds by tilling the weed seeds in the soil, because the seeds are in the soil from weeds that have been in that area for a long time, maybe seeds that have blown into that area. And when you till the soil, you're tilling up weed seeds that have become buried. Weed seeds generally do require light to germinate, and so when you till them up, those seeds germinate, they start to grow, and then it's critical that you control them prior to them making more seed. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can use a herbicide and kill off those weeds prior to their making more seeds, or you can till them again. Tilling them will kill those young seedlings that have just started to grow. It'll pull up more seeds that can then germinate, start to grow, and then you till those. So you may need to till several times over the period of a year, an entire growing season, to kind of exhaust this bank of seeds that are in the soil. I guess one exception to that would be one that Mike already mentioned in talking about weeds and weed control, and that is with quackgrass. When you have quackgrass problems, tilling is only going to make that situation worse. So in that situation, you really do need to use a non-selective herbicide, and don't expect that to completely kill off all of the quackgrass with your first spray. Because the root system is so extensive, you probably will need to allow some regrowth, so you have some green leafy tissue that has grown up after the first time you've knocked it back with a herbicide, and then spray it again once some of that green leafy tissue has emerged again. And you may need to do this several times before you finally kind of starve out that root system, constantly putting its effort into growing new tissue that you just kill back with a herbicide. So the bottom line here is that weed control is very important in areas that are weedy that you're trying to turn into planting beds. Oftentimes you start a planting bed from an area that was previously turf. Now, it may have been very low quality turf. It may have been a lot of weeds that have been mowed and been serving as turf, so that's sort of a sod. But in any case, you have plants that cover the surface of the soil, and you want to get rid of those to prepare your new planting bed. So you have a few options. One of those options is to strip the existing turf, either by machine, which is what you see on the upper right-hand corner there. That blue machine is a sod stripper. And that, thank you for the pointing assistance there, Mike. That really is the ideal way to do it. We used that when we started our new planting beds in the house that I'm currently living in. And in one day, we had all of the beds stripped and all of the beds ready to then start working that soil, adding our organic matter and moving on. You can also do it by hand, especially if you have a small area or if you have small children that you can talk into doing it for you. Because it's not a real easy thing to do by hand. It can be quite time-consuming and labor-intensive, but in small areas, certainly capable of doing it that way. Another method is to smother the existing turf. You can smother that existing turf by placing cardboard or newspaper or black plastic on top of it. It does take several months for that to kill off the turf underneath. But if you're just planting transplants into that area, you can just plant through it. Now on the lower left-hand corner there, the picture you see there is a gentleman who is killing off the turf down below. Using newspapers that he has then covered with topsoil or organic matter or compost to smother that sod underneath. And then that bed would be ready to plant directly into. You would plant by digging through the turf layer that you're trying to smother out and kind of working that planting hole so that the roots can penetrate down below the turf. Well, that's another way to do it with smothering, or you can just leave it covered with the cardboard or mulch or plastic for several months at a time before it will kill off that turf, and then you can plant into that bed. And then the other option is to use a herbicide, so to spray. In the picture over to the right, the garden hose is being used to outline the bed area, and then the area inside that's going to be the planting bed is being sprayed by your friendly moderator, Mike Maddox. So those are kind of the basic ways to go about removing that existing turf when you're starting a bed from a turf setting. Now you have a bed that's ready to work. If you're starting a vegetable garden, you probably will want to remove all of that dead turf. If you're stripping it, it's gone, so that's not a problem. But if you're smothering it or you're killing it off, you will want to remove that dead turf. There are insects that can be harbored in that turf that can cause problems for the vegetable garden. But if you're planting perennials into that area, you can just work in that organic matter of the dead turf, and that organic matter ends up adding to the tilth of the soil and the richness of the soil, so that can be an advantage. And then how much you till, how much you work that soil depends largely on how large the area is and how much energy you have to do it. And you can see here several different options doing it by hand. There's one that's being done with a shovel, another with a garden fork. The garden fork is my favorite way to turn soil. It, I think, prevents the soil from getting too hard clotted. It makes it nice and loose. It breaks up the soil without damaging the structure of the soil. Tillers, on the other hand, are kind of the exact opposite. Tillers, especially if used more than once every couple of years in a planting bed, can easily damage and destroy the soil structure. And it's something to really try to avoid. One of our soil scientists from Rock County, who has come to speak with Master Gardeners in the past, has shocked the entire group by saying that rototillers are like crack cocaine. People get too dependent upon them, and they end up causing problems. The more you use them, people get addicted to them. The soil, when you get done working it, looks so good, and it seems like it's just so gorgeous, so you use it again, and before you know it, you have turned your soil to a fine powder that has no inherent structure anymore. So it's something to watch out for. That little device in the upper left-hand corner is a hand cultivator. I have one of these, and in soil that's already been tilled lightly, and if you're doing it in raised beds like this, it works quite nicely. It is a nice little hand tiller that doesn't cause too much damage as it's being used to till the soil. Well, when we're working the planting bed, you've stripped the sod, you're now getting ready to work the soil. This is the time that you add organic matter. And no matter what kind of soil you have, organic matter, you can never have too much organic matter. Organic matter is anything that is from a living source or is a formerly live product, like cow manure, composted leaves, composted yard waste, cocoa bean shells, all sorts of things can be used as organic matter, but each has its own setting where it's best used. And whether you have a sandy soil or a heavy clay soil, adding organic matter is the best way to improve either one of those types of soil. Now, the pictures that you're seeing in this slide are of coir. It is a coconut product, and it is becoming much more available. You'll find it at all sorts of discount stores as well as high-end garden centers and the large discount home improvement stores as well. It is the fibers from the outside of the coconut shells, which have formerly been kind of a waste product. They were being used for cocoa doormats. It was used to make the inside, to stuff inside upholstered bus seats and train seats and, commercial settings, that kind of thing. But there are allegedly huge piles of the stuff from the coconut industry that are not being used for anything, and they take a very long time to break down, and therefore stay as organic matter and serve the purpose of organic matter for a long time when used as a soil amendment. So one of the pictures here is of a wheelbarrow full of coir and what has come from that one hard block. You buy this stuff in blocks that are very easy to carry home with you, the equivalent of 3 cubic feet of peat moss, but yet a lot easier to tote around with you and to get home. And then when you break up that block, add water to it, allow it to kind of fluff up, you end up with approximately the same volume of organic matter. It takes the place of peat, and peat is unfortunately not a renewable resource. And so sphagnum peat bogs are being mined and take decades and decades to replace. Therefore, they're not the best option for us to use as organic matter for our gardens. But coir is a good option. Recent studies that have been done at various universities around the country have shown that coir serves all of the same purposes as peat moss does, except for the fact that it is not acidic. Peat moss is acidic, and that slight acidity can make the soil itself a little bit more acidic, and that's beneficial when growing acid-loving plants. It's also beneficial when you're starting seeds, and when you start seeds, that little bit of acidic conditions can help to prevent the water mold fungi and the damping off fungi that can kill off new seedlings. But another one of the advantages to coir is that it actually is easier to re-wet than peat moss. Any of you who have had peat moss in a bale, or you've had a pot that has a lot of peat moss in the soil and it dries out completely, and you try and water it and the water just sheds and runs right off of it. That is one of the drawbacks of peat moss. But coir re-wets much more readily. So it's something to look for. In my travels, I have found that you have to be very careful, though, because some of the coir that you find is intended as a mulch, and it's actually little chips of the coconut fibers or coconut shell, whereas the type that you're going to use as an organic matter to incorporate should be the shredded, fine, fibrous product. So just be careful on which ones you purchase when you're, depending on what use you have for it. So to add the organic matter, you'll probably want to add about a 4 to 6 inch layer on top of your planting bed, and double digging is a recommended method to use for working organic matter into the soil and working the soil so that it is well worked up and aerated. It is an awful lot of work, and not everybody bothers with double digging. But the concept for double digging is that you're going to go twice as deep as you would using just one shovelful depth of soil that you're turning over. So starting with the first picture, we're looking at a cross-section of our planting bed, and you take that first shovelful of soil out and you put it outside of the garden. And then the next picture down, you see the darkened area underneath that space is the area that you now work up. You add some organic matter to that, and then you take the next chunk of soil on the top and put it on top of the area you just got done working. Then you work up the area that was down below and add the soil from the next chunk on top of that, and so on until you've gone through the entire garden. Now there are a couple of other ways, graphic depictions of how this is done. I kind of like this one. It helps you to see it a little bit better. So let's say you take your garden and you divide it into half and into strips. So you start out by removing a shovelful of soil and placing it outside the garden. Then you come back in, and underneath there you work up that trench of soil, and then you move back one strip to the strip that has a C on it, and you take that soil and put it into the area that was called A. And you just keep doing that, working your way back, over, and then back up, and finally you end with B, going into the area that was at the end of the garden. Another depiction of that is here. It's kind of hard to describe to people, and so I think having these visuals, these graphics, to show how it's done helps. Another option when you're talking about new planting beds is to use raised beds. Raised beds can be used in a variety of settings. Sometimes it's just too difficult to work the soil that's in the location. It's bad soil, it's heavy, hard, clayey soil. Sometimes you may not be sure what other uses have been made of that soil. Sometimes the soil has a lot of rocks, or that the bedrock is near the surface. Whatever the reason for not wanting to use the parent soil, raised beds can work very nicely. Raised beds can be simply placed directly on top of a turf area. You will need to make sure that that turf area is buried by at least 12 inches so that you don't have grass growing up through the raised beds. And there is a nice little description in the handout, in the chapter, on raised beds. That will give you a little bit more information on how to go about it. But you can use a lot of different products, and they've got all sorts of neat systems now that you can buy that have connecting pieces for corners, and you simply buy the lumber and easy to assemble these beds, or you can just use some 2x12s and nail them together. You also can do raised beds by simply mounding the soil. I kind of like this picture because it shows several different options that were used here. This is a cold frame, but in a sense it's this raised bed that has wood around the side of it. And then there is a raised bed that has rocks around the edge to provide the sides. You see that a lot in flower plantings and flower beds. But you can just mound the soil, and these other beds are just plain mounded soil. And there are some real advantages to just mounding the soil. Part of it is that these beds will dry out quicker in the spring, and they'll warm faster in the spring too, so you can plant them much earlier than if they have sides, even if they have sides. So mounded raised beds can work very well for vegetable garden areas. They work fine for annual beds. Perennial beds, the soil may get too cold over the winter because it does have the exposed sides, that you may lose some of the root systems and the crowns of perennial plants using just mounded raised beds. But you don't need to have fancy, elaborate, or expensive raised beds to get the benefits of raised beds, of the warmer soil, faster draining soils. Well, now we've prepared our beds, whether it be a raised bed or it be an in-ground bed, and it's time to plant. Transplanting is when you take small plants that have a root system and leaves and stems and plant it directly into the site that that plant is going to live. Annuals are done this way very, very frequently, as are perennials and many vegetable plants. Trees and shrubs are also transplanted oftentimes, and those will be discussed in the woody landscape plants section of the training. But for the general rule of thumb for transplanting plants, annuals and perennials, carefully removing the plant from the pot. Sometimes you don't have to be that careful, because sometimes you don't have a choice about being careful, because the plant is very pot bound. It's very difficult to get out of the pot, and you may have to kind of contort the pot, cut the pot to get the plant out of the pot. And the root system can really tolerate quite a bit of abuse. It says to gently tear apart the root ball, and that is true. We don't want to be abusive to the root system, but you can tease that root ball apart and open that up so that the roots are encouraged to branch and to grow into the surrounding soil. If you have a root ball that is very tight with roots, you may even need to slit that root ball in a couple of places vertically, so that will open up that root ball and again stimulate some new roots that will then move into the surrounding soil. I know you've probably all had the experience of taking a plant out of the soil at the end of the growing season, and you've got that geranium plant with that same root ball sitting there that you planted at the beginning of the season, and it really hasn't done too much more than just stay in that area. So teasing apart that root ball can really help to encourage better growth. If there are any damaged stems or roots, prune those away. And also rounding off the edges of this squared, in this case it's a square pot, but those squared off edges, rounding those off before you put them into the soil can be helpful. And then transplanting it by putting it into a hole at about the same level that it was growing in the container. Possibly a little bit deeper. If anything, a little bit deeper. And pushing the soil up around that root ball and maybe slightly up around the stems, but not planting it a lot deeper than it was previously. You want to firm that soil around the root ball without pressing too hard and compacting the soil, and you're going to water it after you've kind of firmed the soil around it, and that watering will help to settle it. It'll help to remove air pockets from around that root ball and help to settle the soil in around it. So you really don't need to push that in real hard, and you actually can damage, again, the structure of the soil by doing that. And of course, when you transplant things, anytime you transplant something, you should use a starter fertilizer. Starter fertilizers are those that have a higher phosphorus level. And we'll talk a little bit more about fertilizers in a minute, but that the three numbers on a fertilizer product, that middle number is the phosphorus level in that product. And starter fertilizers have a higher phosphorus level, and that helps to stimulate rooting. which is what we're trying to encourage when we are transplanting. So that's transplanting very briefly. Sowing seed, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on sowing seed because it kind of varies from crop to crop and setting to setting. And I know that in the annuals and perennials section, the speaker will go into more detail on this. But in essence, the main difference is that you do need to prepare the soil so that it is a fine seed bed. You don't want any large chunks or clumps of soil because the seed needs to make good contact with soil and not have pockets of air around it between the clump of soil and the seed so that the seed dries out. That fine seed bed helps to hold the moisture around the seed until it has germinated and gets growing. When you prepare the seed bed, as a general rule, whether you're doing annuals, perennials, or vegetables, you do apply a fertilizer, and that is best done as a granular fertilizer. And there are different rates for different kinds of crops that you're growing, whether it's an annual, perennial, or a vegetable, and those are all listed in the chapters in your manuals on those topics. But a granular fertilizer works very nicely because it can just be lightly broadcast across the soil and then using a bow rake or a hard rake, a garden rake, to spread it out and then sow the seed directly into that area. Using fine soil to cover the seed and a fine soil to cover it, sometimes you'll need to bring that in from someplace else. You may actually need to use a shredded sphagnum peat to help hold in some moisture to give you that acidic advantage and still have good aeration as a way to cover the seed. And sometimes you just bring in soil from other parts of the garden that are a finer soil so that it has good seed soil contact for sowing seeds. And then water it very carefully. This is the time that I really like to use a watering can with a very fine nose on the end, as they call it, the device on the end that kind of breaks it up into a very fine stream. Very, very fine, especially with very small seeds, or you'll tend to wash those seeds away.